The message came through at 3 in the morning. Ship time. Captain Daniel Price was sleeping in his quarters when the alarm pulled him from his dreams. He rolled out of bed and walked to the communication panel, rubbing his eyes. The screen showed an emergency signal from a sector of space that humans rarely visited. Daniel pressed the button and the message began to play. The face on the screen was small and blue, with large dark eyes that held a deep sadness. Daniel recognized the species immediately. Everyone on Earth would recognize them. They were the Valori. "This is Ambassador Kaitha of Valora," the recording said. "We are sending this message to Earth because we have nowhere else to turn. The Githrani Dominion has declared war on our world. Their fleet will arrive in 30 days. We have no military. We have no weapons. We have no allies who will stand against them. We do not ask for help because we have no right to ask. We only wanted Earth to know what is happening. You were kind to us once, long ago. We remember that kindness. Whatever happens, we wanted you to know that we remember." The message ended. Daniel stood in the dark room for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk and began typing orders. Within the hour, his ship changed course toward Earth. 60 years ago, humanity had faced extinction. A series of crop failures had spread across the planet. The soil turned dead. The oceans grew too warm. Billions of people were starving. Earth sent desperate signals into space, hoping someone would hear. Most of the galaxy ignored them. The major powers saw no value in helping a primitive species on a dying world. Some even laughed at the idea. Humans were nothing. They had no technology, no resources, nothing to offer. But the Valori came anyway. They were a small species from a small world. They had no great military strength. They had no political power. The Galactic Council considered them unimportant. But when they heard Earth's cries for help, they loaded their ships with food and medicine and flew across the stars to help strangers. They had never met. Ambassador Kaitha led that mission. She was young then, barely an adult by Valori standards. She walked through the refugee camps of Earth and saw the suffering with her own eyes. Children with swollen bellies. Parents too weak to stand. Old people dying in the streets. The Valori gave everything they had. They emptied their food stores. They shared their farming technology. They taught humans how to heal their damaged soil. The Galactic Council mocked them for it. The Valori homeworld fell into poverty because of their generosity. Other species called them fools, but they never regretted their choice. They had seen people suffering and they had helped. That was enough. Now, 60 years later, the Valori were the ones who needed help, and the galaxy was ignoring them, just as it had once ignored Earth. Daniel arrived at Earth Command 2 days later. He walked straight to the office of Admiral Lisa Morgan, the highest-ranking officer in the human fleet. She was a tall woman with gray hair and sharp eyes. Her grandfather had been one of the children saved by Valori food shipments during the famine. She had grown up hearing stories about the little blue angels who came from the stars. Daniel handed her the message. Lisa watched it in silence. When it finished, she set down the tablet and looked out the window at the city below. The buildings were tall and strong. The streets were full of people living their lives. All of it existed because the Valori had shown kindness when no one else would. How long until the Githrani reached Valora? Lisa asked. 28 days now, Daniel said. And the Githrani fleet? 300 warships. Maybe more. Lisa nodded slowly. We have 400 combat-ready vessels. Another 50 that can be prepared in 2 weeks. Daniel stared at her. Admiral, are you suggesting we commit our entire fleet? I am not suggesting anything, Captain. I am giving you an order. Lisa turned to face him. Her eyes were cold and hard. Scramble every ship we have. Pull them from every station, every patrol, every colony. We are going to Valora. The council will object, Daniel said. The Kethrani are a major power. If we go to war with them, we will make enemies across the galaxy. Let them object. Lisa sat down at her desk and began typing commands. The Valori fed our grandparents when the rest of the galaxy left us to starve. They gave us everything and asked for nothing. Now someone is trying to kill them, and you want to talk about politics? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. No, Admiral. I want to talk about battle plans. The order went out across all of human space. Every military vessel was called back to Earth. Every soldier was placed on alert. The message was simple and clear. The Valori were in danger. Humanity was going to save them. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans who had served alongside Valori aid workers during the Reconstruction years volunteered to return to active duty. Young soldiers who had grown up hearing stories about the famine enlisted in record numbers. Civilians offered their ships, their resources, their lives died in the halls of Earth Command. Lisa gathered her senior officers for a briefing. She showed them maps of Valori space. She explained the Kethrani fleet positions. She outlined the dangers they would face. The Kethrani were larger, better armed, and more experienced in warfare. This would not be an easy fight. Some of you may be wondering why we are doing this, Lisa said to the room full of soldiers. The Valori are small. They have no military value. They cannot help us in return. By every practical measure, this mission makes no sense. She paused and looked at the faces around her. These were good people. They had families. They had lives. She was asking them to risk everything for a species on the other side of the galaxy. But 60 years ago, the Valori did not ask if we had military value. They did not calculate what we could offer them. They saw people suffering, and they helped. That is who they are. Lisa straightened her shoulders. And now we will show the galaxy who we are. We are the species that remembers. We remember those who hurt us, and we remember those who helped. The Valori helped us when we had nothing. Now we have something to give in return. She pressed a button and the fleet deployment orders appeared on every screen in the room. Prepare your ships. We leave in 3 days. And may whatever gods the Kethrani pray to have mercy on them. Because we will not. The room erupted in cheers. The word spread across Earth and beyond. Humanity was going to war. Not for power. Not for resources. Not for territory. They were going to war because someone had been kind to them once, and they had never forgotten. The Valori had saved humanity with compassion. Now humanity would save the Valori with fire. The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. Every species with access to the communication networks heard the same incredible story. The humans were mobilizing their entire military force. They were preparing for war against the Kethrani Dominion. And they were doing it all for the VEL or II. In the great halls of the Galactic Council. Ambassadors from 100 worlds gathered to discuss this strange development. Most of them did not understand what was happening. The Valori were nobody. They had no wealth, no power, no military strength. Why would any species risk so much for them? Ambassador Zethrak of the Kethrani Dominion stood before the assembly with a smile on his face. He was tall and covered in dark scales, with yellow eyes that glowed in the dim light. The Kethrani were warriors. They had built their empire through conquest and fear. The idea of fighting for someone else's benefit was foreign to them. The humans are fools, Zethrak said to the council. They waste their strength on a worthless cause. The Valori have nothing to offer them. This is sentiment, not strategy. Our fleet outnumbers theirs 3 to 1. If they wish to throw away their lives for a species of weaklings, we will gladly help them. Some members of the council laughed. Others looked uncertain. A few remained silent and thoughtful. They had heard stories about humans. Strange stories about a species that never forgot a grudge and never abandoned a friend. But surely those were just stories. On Earth, the preparations continued at a speed that amazed even the humans themselves. Commander Ryan Scott was put in charge of coordinating the ground forces. He was a big man with broad shoulders and a quiet voice. He had never met a Valori in person, but his mother had. She had been a little girl during the famine, sick and starving in a camp in what used to be called Kansas. A Valori relief worker had carried her to the medical tent on his back, walking through the mud for 3 miles because all the vehicles were broken. That Valori had died a few years later from a human disease his body could not fight. He had known the risk when he came to Earth, but he came anyway. Ryan's mother kept a picture of him on her wall until the day she died. Now, Ryan looked at the thousands of soldiers gathering at the staging grounds and felt the weight of that debt pressing down on him. These were good men and women. Some of them would not come home. But not one of them had hesitated when they heard where they were going and why. Lieutenant Kate Morrison was one of the first pilots to arrive. She was young, only 26, with red hair cut short and a face full of freckles. She had flown combat missions before, but never anything like this. Before she left, she went to visit her grandmother in a small town in Ohio. Her grandmother was 93 years old now, thin and frail, but her mind was still sharp. She sat in her chair by the window and looked at Kate with eyes that had seen too much suffering and too much kindness. "You know why I am going," Kate said. It was not a question. Her grandmother nodded slowly. "The Valori?" "Yes." The old woman reached into a drawer beside her chair and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully and held it up. It was a photograph, faded and yellow with age. The picture showed a small blue figure carrying a child through a muddy field. The child was skin and bones, barely alive. The Valori looked exhausted, but there was determination in those large, dark eyes. "Her name was Mira," Kate's grandmother said. "She carried me for 2 days when my parents were too weak to walk. She gave me her own food even though she was hungry too. When I asked her why, she said it was because I was a child and children should not suffer." Kate took the photograph gently in her hands. She had seen it before, many times. But now it felt different. Now it felt like a mission. "You bring them home safe," her grandmother said. "You hear me? All of them. We owe them everything." Kate hugged her grandmother carefully, afraid she might break. "I will. I promise." The human fleet launched 3 days later, just as Admiral Lisa Morgan had ordered. 400 warships rose from their stations and formed into battle groups. They were not the largest ships in the galaxy. They were not the most advanced. But they were crewed by men and women who knew exactly why they were fighting. As the fleet passed the outer colonies, something unexpected began to happen. Civilian vessels started joining the formation. Cargo ships, passenger liners, mining rigs that had been fitted with whatever weapons their crews could find. They came from every corner of human space. Miners, traders, farmers, scientists. People who had no business going to war. Captain Daniel Price watched them arrive on his tactical display and felt something tighten in his chest. He opened the channel to one of the civilian ships, a battered cargo hauler that looked like it might fall apart at any moment. "This is Captain Price of the Horizon's Edge. You are entering a combat zone. You should turn back." The response came from an old man with a weathered face and calloused hands. "Captain, my grandfather was fed by the Valori when he was dying in a camp in Brazil. My grandmother learned to farm again because of their technology. My parents met in a Valori-built hospital. I exist because of them. You think I am going to sit at home while someone tries to kill them?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Welcome to the fleet. Stay behind the warships and follow our signals." "Yes, sir." "And Captain?" "Give them hell." Back at the Galactic Council, Ambassador Zethrak received the latest intelligence reports. His amusement faded as he read through the data. He had expected a token force, a few dozen ships at most. Instead, the humans had emptied their territories. They had left their own worlds merely defenseless. They had committed everything they had to this fight. "This is madness," he said to his advisors. "No rational species would do this. They are leaving themselves open to attack from any enemy who wishes to strike." One of his advisors, an older Kathrani with scars from many battles, spoke carefully. "Perhaps that is the point, Ambassador. Perhaps they are showing the galaxy something." "Showing them what?" "That there are things they value more than their own safety. That there are debts they will pay no matter the cost." The advisor paused. "It is unsettling." Zethrak threw the report onto his desk. "They are humans. They are barely out of their caves. They cannot defeat us." But even as he said the words, a small seed of doubt had planted itself in his mind. He had conquered many worlds and destroyed many enemies, but he had never faced an enemy who fought for something other than survival or power. He did not know how to predict what such an enemy would do. The human fleet continued its journey across the stars. In every ship, soldiers prepared themselves for what was coming. They cleaned their weapons. They checked their equipment. They wrote letters to loved ones they might never see again. And in the quiet moments, they thought about why they were doing this. They thought about the stories they had heard growing up. They thought about the little blue people who had crossed the galaxy to help strangers. They thought about the debt that was finally being paid. The Valori had taught humanity something important all those years ago. They had taught them that kindness was not weakness, that helping others was not foolish, that the measure of a species was not how much they could take, but how much they could give. Now humanity was about to teach the galaxy a lesson of its own. A lesson about what happens when you threaten the friends of a species that never forgets. The stars blurred as the fleet jumped to faster than light speed. Valora was waiting, and so was war. The human fleet dropped out of faster than light speed at the edge of the Valora system. What they saw made their blood run cold. The Kathrani had already arrived. 300 warships hung in orbit around the small blue world, and bright flashes of light showed where their weapons were striking the surface below. Captain Daniel Price stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and watched the bombardment through the main display screen. Cities were burning, forests were turning to ash. The Valori had no way to fight back. They could only run and hide and die. "All ships, battle stations," Daniel said into the fleet-wide channel. His voice was calm and steady, but his hands were tight on the arms of his chair. "This is what we came for. Remember who we are fighting for. Remember what they did for us. Now let us show these Kathrani what happens when you threaten our friends." The human fleet moved forward in perfect formation. 400 warships and nearly 100 civilian vessels converted for combat. Against them stood the might of the Kathrani Dominion. Veterans of 100 conquests, Admiral Lisa Morgan commanded the fleet from the Bridge of the Remembrance, a massive battleship named for the years of famine. She had spent the entire journey planning this battle. She knew the Kathrani were stronger. She knew they had better weapons and more experienced crews. But she also knew something the Kathrani did not understand. Humans did not fight like other species. When they believed in something, truly believed in it, they became something more than soldiers. They became a force that could not be measured in numbers or technology. The first shots were fired when the fleets came within range of each other. Kathrani plasma cannons tore through the void, striking human shields and setting hulls on fire. Human railguns answered, punching holes through Kathrani armor. The battle had begun. Lieutenant Kate Morrison led her squadron of fighters into the chaos. Her small ship twisted and turned through a storm of weapons fire, dodging death by inches. Around her, pilots she had trained with for years were dying. She heard their screams on the radio as their ships exploded. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Her target was a Kethrani cruiser that was still firing on the planet below. Even in the middle of a battle, they were killing civilians. Kate pushed her engines to maximum and aimed straight for the cruiser's weapon systems. "Morrison, pull back," her commander shouted over the radio. "You are too close. You will not survive that run." "I am not pulling back," Kate answered. Her grandmother's photograph was taped to her control panel. She looked at it one more time. A little blue figure carrying a dying child through the mud. Not today. She fired everything she had. Missiles and energy beams tore into the cruiser's hull. The weapon systems exploded in a ball of fire. Kate pulled away at the last second, her ship's wings scraping against debris. She had survived. The cruiser had not. On the ground, Commander Ryan Scott led his Marines through the burning streets of a Valori city. The buildings were small, designed for people half his height. Everything was broken and covered in ash. Bodies lay everywhere, small blue forms that had never held a weapon in their lives. Ryan found a group of Valori civilians, hiding in the basement of a collapsed building. They screamed when they saw him. He was huge compared to them, covered in armor, carrying weapons that could destroy their entire shelter with one shot. They thought he had come to finish what the Kethrani started. Ryan knelt down and removed his helmet. He showed them his human face, dirty and tired but trying to smile. "It is okay," he said softly. "We are here to help. We are from Earth." The Valori looked at each other in confusion. One of them, an elderly male with silver in his blue skin, stepped forward slowly. "Earth?" he asked. "The humans? But why? Why would you come?" "Because you came for us," Ryan said. 60 years ago. You came when no one else would. Did you think we would forget?" The old Valori began to cry. He reached out and touched Ryan's armored hand with his small fingers. We thought no one remembered. We thought no one cared." "We remember," Ryan said. "We all remember. Now come with us. We will get you somewhere safe." His Marines formed a protective circle around the Valori civilians and began moving toward the evacuation point. Along the way, they found more survivors. Children separated from their parents. Injured people who could not walk. Old ones too weak to run. The Marines carried them all. A young Valori girl walked beside Ryan, holding on to his armored leg because there was nowhere else safe to hold. She looked up at him with those big dark eyes that every human child learned about in school. "Why do you fight for us?" she asked. "We are small. We have nothing." Ryan stopped walking. He knelt down so he was at her level. The battle still raged around them, explosions shaking the ground, but he took the time to answer her question. 60 years ago, my mother was a little girl like you. She was hungry and sick and dying. One of your people carried her to safety. He gave her food and medicine. He saved her life." Ryan paused. "You say you have nothing, but that is not true. You gave us something more valuable than gold or weapons or power. You gave us hope when we had none. You gave us kindness when everyone else looked away. That is worth more than you can ever know." The girl thought about this for a moment. Then she hugged Ryan's armored arm as best she could. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Ryan said. "Thank you. Thank your people. Now let us get you out of here." In orbit, the battle was reaching its peak. The Kethrani had expected an easy victory. They had expected humans to be disorganized and weak, like every other species they had conquered. They were wrong. Human ships that were too damaged to fight did not retreat. They aimed their broken hulls at enemy vessels and went to full speed. Pilots ejected from their dying fighters, only to use remote controls to guide their burning craft into Kethrani engines. Captains refused to surrender, even when their ships were falling apart around them. Admiral Lisa Morgan watched her fleet being torn to pieces, but she also watched the Kethrani numbers falling. The enemy was losing ships faster than they expected. Faster than they could afford. A transmission came through from the Kethrani flagship. Admiral Vethkai, commander of the Dominion fleet, appeared on the screen. His scales were dark with anger and his yellow eyes burned with something that might have been fear. "This is madness," he said. "You are throwing away your lives for nothing. The Valori cannot give you anything. They have no value." Lisa looked at him with cold eyes. "You measure value in what can be taken. We measure it differently. You will all die here. Your species will be weakened. Your enemies will strike while you are vulnerable. This makes no sense. Let me explain something to you, Admiral." Lisa leaned forward. 60 years ago, we were nobody. We were dying. The galaxy left us to starve. But the Valori came. They gave us everything they had. They saved us when they had nothing to gain. She paused. "We will not let them die. Not while a single human ship can still fly. Not while a single human soldier can still fight. You can kill every one of us, and the last one standing will still be trying to protect them. That is who we are. That is what we do. And if you cannot understand that, then you have already lost." Vethkai stared at her for a long moment. Then the transmission ended. The battle continued for 6 more hours. When it was over, the Kethrani had lost half their fleet. The survivors fled into deep space, leaving Valora behind. Human ships, battered and broken, filled the sky above the small blue world. They had won. The price was terrible, but they had won. And on the surface below, Valori civilians emerged from their hiding places and looked up at the human ships that had saved them. Many of them fell to their knees and wept. Others raised their arms toward the sky in gratitude. The humans had come, just like the Valori had come for them so long ago. The debt was being paid. The Kethrani Dominion sued for peace 3 days after the battle. Their remaining ships had fled back to their home territory, and their ambassador stood before the Galactic Council looking nothing like the confident conqueror he had been before. His scales had gone pale, and his yellow eyes kept moving around the room, as if he expected an attack at any moment. Ambassador Zethrak spoke words he had never imagined saying. "The Dominion wishes to negotiate an end to hostilities with Earth." The council chamber was silent. Every ambassador, every representative, every observer in the gallery was watching. This was history being made. The Kethrani had never asked for peace before. They had always been the ones dictating terms to defeated enemies. Admiral Lisa Morgan appeared on the communication screen from orbit around Valora. Behind her, through the windows of her ship, the damaged hulls of the human fleet could be seen. They had paid a heavy price for this victory. Nearly a third of their ships were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Thousands of soldiers had died, but they had won. And now it was time to collect. "The Dominion wishes to negotiate," Lisa repeated, her voice flat and cold. "Very well. Here are our terms." She began listing her demands, and with each one, the council chamber grew more tense. The Kethrani would pay reparations to Valora, not in money, but in resources. Food, medicine, building materials. Everything needed to rebuild what they had destroyed. The Kethrani would provide workers to help repair the damage. Their engineers would rebuild the cities they had burned. Their doctors would treat the people they had injured. The Kethrani would formally recognize Valora as a protected world under human guardianship. Any future attack on Valora would be treated as an attack on Earth itself. And finally, The Kethrani would release a public statement acknowledging their aggression and apologizing to the Valori people. When Lisa finished, the chamber exploded in protests. Several ambassadors stood up shouting. The terms were too harsh. They violated precedent. They would destabilize the balance of power in the galaxy. Zethrak found his voice again. These terms are unacceptable. The Dominion will not be humiliated in this way. We will return to war before we accept such demands. Lisa looked at him through the screen. Her face showed no emotion, but her eyes were like ice. Then return to war, she said simply. We will be waiting. You are bluffing. Your fleet is broken. You cannot sustain another major engagement. Perhaps. Lisa nodded slowly. But neither can you. And there is something else you should consider, Ambassador. Something important. She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to something almost soft. We did not come here for conquest. We did not come here for territory or resources or power. We came because someone was kind to us once, a long time ago, and we do not forget. Ever. She paused. So ask yourself this question, Ambassador. If this is what we do for our friends, what do you think we will do to enemies who threaten them? What do you think we will do if we decide that the Kethrani Dominion itself is a threat that needs to be removed? The chamber fell silent again. Even the species who had been protesting stopped moving. They were all looking at the human admiral with new eyes. This was not an empty threat. Everyone in the room could see that. This woman would burn the Dominion to ashes if she thought it would keep the Valori safe. Zethrak opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in his long career, he did not know what to say. An older Kethrani advisor stepped forward and whispered something in his ear. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes. Finally, Zethrak turned back to the screen. The Dominion accepts your terms. Lisa nodded once. Wise choice. The communication ended, and the council chamber slowly began to empty. But the conversations that followed would continue for years. Something had changed in the galaxy that day. A new power had announced itself, and it operated by rules that most species had never considered. On Valora, the news of the peace agreement spread quickly. Valori civilians emerged from the evacuation shelters to find human soldiers still guarding them. The massive armored figures that had seemed so frightening at first were now symbols of hope. They handed out food and helped clear debris. They carried injured people to medical stations. They played with children whose parents were too overwhelmed to keep track of them. Commander Ryan Scott was supervising relief efforts when he received word that someone wanted to see him. He followed his guide to a small building that had survived the bombardment mostly intact. Inside, he found an elderly Valori female sitting in a chair that was too small for any human. She was thin and fragile, with skin that had faded from blue to almost gray with age. But her eyes were sharp and clear. Ryan recognized her immediately. Every human knew that face. Ambassador Kaida, he said, bowing his head in respect. It is an honor. Kaida looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read. It might have been wonder. It might have been confusion. It might have been something deeper. You are the one they call Commander Scott, she said. Her voice was soft and tired. They tell me you carried our children to safety with your own hands. Yes, ma'am. It was the least I could do. The least you could do. She repeated the words slowly, as if trying to understand them. You crossed the galaxy. You fought a war. Your people died. And you call it the least you could do? Ryan knelt down so he was closer to her level. Even kneeling, he was still bigger than her. Ambassador, 60 years ago, your people came to Earth. You gave us everything you had. You saved us when no one else would lift a finger to help. Did you think we would forget that? Kaida was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to cry. The tears ran down her aged face like small rivers, and her thin shoulders shook with sobs. I never thought. I never imagined. She could not finish the sentence. Ryan waited patiently. He had learned that the Valori needed time to express their emotions. They felt things deeply, perhaps more deeply than humans did. Finally, Kaida looked up at him again. Do you know why we helped your people all those years ago? I have always wondered, Ryan admitted. It was because we could. She wiped her eyes with a small cloth. It was that simple. We saw people suffering. We had the ability to help. So we helped. We never expected anything in return. We never thought anyone would remember. That is exactly why we remember, Ryan said. That is exactly why we came. You helped us without expecting thanks. But we are humans. We do not forget kindness. We do not abandon friends. And we pay our debts, Ambassador. We always pay our debts. Later that day, Captain Daniel Price arrived to pay his own respects. He found Kaida surrounded by human officers, all of them treating her with a reverence normally reserved for the greatest heroes. She seemed overwhelmed by the attention. Daniel took her small blue hand in his much larger one. Her skin was cool and smooth, like river stones. Ma'am, there are statues of you on Earth, he said. Hospitals named after your relief workers. Schools teach our children about what you did. Every year, we have a holiday to remember the day your ships arrived. You saved us when we were nobody. You believed in us when no one else did. Kaida shook her head slowly. We did not do so much. We only shared what we had. That was everything, Daniel said. That was more than everything. And now we are here to make sure no one ever threatens you again. For as long as humanity exists, Valora will be protected. That is our promise. That is our debt, finally paid. Kaida looked at him, then at the other humans filling the room, then at the window where human ships still patrolled the sky. We thought we were alone, she whispered. For 60 years, we thought no one remembered us. No one cared. Daniel smiled at her. You were never alone. You just did not know it yet. The months that followed the Battle of Valora changed the galaxy in ways that no one had predicted. The Kethrani Dominion, once feared throughout known space, became quiet and cautious. Their fleets stayed close to home. Their ambassadors spoke softly in council meetings. They had learned something about humans that they would never forget. But the Kethrani were not the only ones who learned a lesson that day. Meyer. Species across the galaxy began reaching out to Earth. These were peoples who had been ignored for centuries. Small civilizations without military power or economic value. Species that the major powers had pushed aside or exploited without consequence. They had watched the Battle of Valora with amazement. They had seen humans throw everything they had into defending a people who could offer nothing in return. Now they wanted to know if the stories were true. Were humans really a species that remembered kindness? Were they really willing to fight for friends? One by one, they sent messages. Some were requests for trade. Some were proposals for cultural exchange. Some were simply questions, carefully worded, asking if humanity might be willing to extend friendship to those who had none. Admiral Lisa Morgan returned to Earth as a hero. The streets were filled with crowds, cheering for her, and for all the soldiers who had fought at Valora. But she did not feel like celebrating. Too many of her people had not come home. Too many families were grieving instead of rejoicing. She gave speeches and accepted awards because that was what was expected of her. But the moment that meant the most to her happened in private, in a small room at a veterans hospital. A young pilot named Kate Morrison was recovering from injuries she had suffered during the battle. Her ship had been hit in the final hours of fighting, and she had barely survived. Lisa sat beside her bed and took her hand. You did good work out there, Lieutenant. Kate managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Admiral. I just wish I could have done more." "You did enough. You did more than enough." Lisa paused. "Your grandmother would be proud." Kate's eyes filled with tears. "She died while I was in recovery. I never got to tell her that we won." "She knew," Lisa said softly. "I promise you, she knew." On Valora, the reconstruction began. True to the peace agreement, Kethrani workers arrived to help rebuild what their weapons had destroyed. At first, the Valori were afraid of them. These were the same people who had tried to wipe them out. But the humans stayed close by, watching, making sure the Kethrani kept their promises. Over time, something unexpected happened. Some of the Kethrani workers began to change. They saw the Valori up close for the first time. They worked alongside them, building homes and schools and hospitals. They learned their names and heard their stories. A few of them began to understand why the humans had fought so hard to protect them. One Kethrani engineer named Vethsa wrote a letter to his family back home. He described the Valori as gentle and kind, nothing like the weaklings he had been taught to despise. He wrote about a Valori child who had brought him water when he was working in the hot sun, even though he had been part of the force that destroyed her home. He wrote that he was beginning to think everything he had been taught about strength and weakness might be wrong. The letter was intercepted by Kethrani intelligence, but they did not know what to do with it. Vethsa was not alone. Many of the workers were sending similar messages home. Something was changing in the Dominion. Slowly but surely, Ambassador Kaida recovered her strength in the months after the battle. She was still frail, but there was a new light in her eyes. She had spent decades believing that her people's sacrifice had been forgotten. Now she knew the truth. The Galactic Council invited her to speak at their annual assembly. It was the first time a Valori representative had been given such an honor. She stood at the podium, small and ancient, surrounded by delegates from species that had ignored her people for generations. 60 years ago, my people made a choice, she began. Her voice was quiet, but the chamber was silent enough that everyone could hear. We saw a world suffering. We had very little, but we had enough to help. So we helped. We did not calculate the cost. We did not measure the benefit. We simply did what we believed was right. She paused and looked around the chamber. Hundreds of faces looked back at her, representing civilizations with power beyond anything Valora could imagine. For many years, I wondered if that choice had been foolish. My people paid a heavy price for our generosity. We faced poverty and hardship. We were mocked by those who called us weak. I began to believe that kindness was a burden that brought nothing but suffering. Kaida straightened her thin shoulders. I was wrong. The humans have shown me that I was wrong. They have shown all of us something important. Kindness is never wasted. Compassion is never forgotten. The seeds we plant with our good deeds may take years to grow, but they will grow. And sometimes they grow into something magnificent. She looked directly at the camera that was broadcasting her words across the galaxy. We fed a hungry world. 60 years later, they moved the stars to save us. Let this be a lesson to every empire, every council, every civilization that believes power comes only from strength. The humans have shown us another way. On Earth, the veterans of Valora slowly returned to their normal lives. Commander Ryan Scott went back to teaching at the military academy. He had a new lesson to add to his courses now. He called it the Valori Principle. It taught young officers that true strength was not measured in weapons or ships, but in the bonds between those who stood together against the darkness. Lieutenant Kate Morrison recovered from her injuries and returned to active duty. She kept her grandmother's photograph with her wherever she went. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would look at it and remember why she had chosen this life. The little blue figure carrying the dying child. That image meant more to her than any medal or commendation. Captain Daniel Price was promoted to Admiral after Lisa Morgan retired. He spent the rest of his career building relationships with the minor species who had reached out after Valora. He believed that humanity's greatest strength was not its military, but its capacity for loyalty and friendship. The final ceremony of the Valora campaign was held in Geneva, at a memorial that had stood for 60 years. The names of every Valori relief worker who had served on Earth during the famine were inscribed on a wall of white stone. For decades, only a few humans had visited this place. Now it was surrounded by crowds. Ryan Scott and the surviving members of his unit arrived carrying flowers. 400 bouquets, one for every ship that had flown to Valora. They'd placed them at the base of the wall, covering the ground in color. Admiral Lisa Morgan gave the final address. She stood before the memorial with the sun setting behind her, and she spoke words that would be remembered for generations. "We are not a perfect species," she said. "We have made mistakes, and we will make more. We have been cruel and selfish and blind. But there is something in us that refuses to forget. Something that holds on to the good that others do for us, even when the rest of the galaxy moves on." She turned to look at the names on the wall. So many names. So many people who had given everything for strangers. Today, we proved that human gratitude is not just a feeling. It is a force. It is a promise. And any civilization that shows us kindness will never stand alone. Any friend who stands with us will be defended to our last breath. Any debt we owe will be paid, no matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs. She faced the crowd again. Thousands of humans and dozens of Valori who had come to witness this moment. The Valori taught us that kindness can save a world. Today, we showed them that it can also shake one. Let the galaxy remember this. Let them remember what humans do for those who help us. And let them understand that this is only the beginning. The ceremony ended as the stars came out overhead. The same stars that had witnessed the Valori ships arriving 60 years ago. The same stars that had watched human fleets racing to save them. The same stars that would watch over both species from now until the end of time. Because humans do not forget. They remember those who hurt them, and they remember those who helped. And their gratitude, like their anger, can shake worlds. The Valori had planted a seed of kindness 6 decades ago. Now the whole galaxy could see what had grown from it, and they would never look at humanity the same way again.